Your pretty things deserve a pretty place to sit, and a vanity tray like this is the perfect place to neatly display your makeup, jewelry, candles, or anything that you like. In this video, we're going to show you how you can make this faux rose quartz vanity tray using epoxy resin. With its beautiful, shimmering, natural stone-like appearance, it's going to allow you to bring the beauty of nature indoors, and it's so fun to make. Welcome to My Modern Met Maker. We're going to be showing you some of the coolest crafts and the tools that you're going to need to complete them at home. My name is Lacey. I am My Modern Met's in-house maker, and I am so excited to get started. In order to make this tutorial, you're going to need a pretty decent amount of supplies. The first is you're going to want some sort of disposable cup that has some measuring increments on it so that you can measure precisely. Something to mix up your resin. I like to use tongue depressors. You want to protect your hands and your skin, so I put on gloves. And we'll also want some other safety gear, something like a respirator, and if you've got goggles or something like that, put those on to protect the mucous membranes in your eyes. You'll need some resin. Depending on what you want to do with this, you might want to check what the resin is rated for. Some are food safe and some are not. Then you're going to want some additives. I have some mica powders in a few different colors. I'm going to be making a rose quartz, so I've got some variation here. I've got some peachy, pinks, white, as well as some kind of beige pearlescent mica powder. You might also want some resin dye. Believe it or not, this is a red and a white resin dye. They are completely coated. They do get pretty messy pretty quickly if you're not careful. You'll want some rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle, some sort of an X-Acto knife or a blade, some white acrylic paint, any white acrylic paint will do, some paper towels. This gets pretty messy. You'll need the mold. You can see mine is already completed in here as a sneak peek. Any hardware if your tray is going to have handles, and then some way to actually attach that. For mine, I actually had to drill holes, and so I'm going to be using this Dremel and different attachments that will fit into this. If you don't like the colors I chose here, remember tutorials are highly adaptable, so use the colors that we're mixing up and the additives that we're using as options for you rather than strict guidelines. So instead, we'll kind of be talking about the tone and how I am varying the contrast of colors in here. The first thing that you need to do though is start with an epoxy or a resin. Choosing the right resin for your project can be a little tricky. Some are made for food, some are made for art, some are even made for sealing in boats. So make sure you read the reviews and the product descriptions to make sure that the resin you choose is going to fit the purpose you want. Mixing up resin is a science for a reason, so we want to make sure that we actually use a cup that is going to allow us to measure the correct amounts so that we know how to mix the resin properly. Without some way to measure it, we could be off, and you don't want to go by feeling on these or they won't cure properly. I start with a super good mix of quite a bit of just clear resin, and this takes a while to actually get these fully incorporated. Make sure you're really scraping the sides and the bottom and really combining this together. If you have an uneven mix, the resin will not cure properly. Once I've fully mixed up the transparent or clear resin, I will actually separate these into a couple different cups and add different amounts of colors and additives to each of them so we have a little variation. For this project, we're going to be working in layers, so make sure you mix up enough resin that's going to coat the bottom of this, but not enough that's going to fill it all the way up. You want to do at least 2 layers of resin. I'm going to be doing 3, so I want just the amount that's going to cover the bottom of this resin mold I have. The layers are going to have this really beautiful subtle effect if you use enough transparent resin so that you can actually see through to layers before, and if you hold it up to the light, it's going to shine through in a really beautiful way. I recommend mixing up 3 to 4 different colors. You're going to want one that is more pigmented, something a little more neutral, and one that's a little more translucent. Once you're happy with the colors you have, you want to go ahead and start filling your mold. Since we're emulating natural stone, We want to have a lot of variation in where we put these colors. Put them in greater saturations in certain areas, maybe some drizzles in a few areas. Just have a little fun with how you put this resin down as your base layer and get it nice and coated, just enough where it's going to reach the edges, and if you need to, you can use your stirring sticks to kind of push them to the edges, and then I give it a good swirl. Once you're happy with your base layer, you're going to want to pop any air bubbles that are on the surface so it gets a nice even finish, and I like to use a spray bottle with rubbing alcohol in it to do that. The next step we're going to do, we want to wait till the next day once the resin has partially cured, and that's actually add some cracks in so that it's going to really give it that feel of rock. Different resins are going to have different cure times, and they won't be fully cured the next day, but they should be hard enough where you can cut into them and not so hard that you won't be able to cut into them. You're going to want to check your resin to see what your curing times are going to be. In order to make these cracks, I take an X-Acto knife and I just score the top. I'm cutting in enough to where there's going to be a visible line that I can then add white acrylic paint into it, but I try to vary the distance between lines, the direction of them, and give them some natural variation so that it's going to mimic the look of a rock. Then we're actually going to be adding just some acrylic paint. And I am using a Artist Loft Flow acrylic, and I just put some of that paint right on there, and then with a paper towel, I'm going to scrub this in, kind of like a cleaning exercise. I'm making sure that this paint is getting down and into those cracks so that they are filled and you can actually see where these are. Now, if you work quickly with this, the acrylic paint is going to start to dry, but you can take a clean paper towel and actually kind of wipe it off. It will leave behind a little residue, but that actually ends up looking really nice. But you want to get the majority of the excess off and make sure that it's really just focused on being inside those cracks, because that's the part we're really trying to highlight here with this step. If it starts to dry a little bit too much, you can do a few things. You could wet it. You can also add a little more paint, which is going to add a little more moisture and actually help you get some of it off. Or you can do a bit harder scrubbing before it dries way too much. I actually really liked the look of toning this base layer down with a little extra paint, so I actually added a little more paint and I did a little bit more dabbing and layer building with that so that it would actually give a slightly cloudy impression while still being able to see the resin underneath it. Then we're going to let this dry for a few hours. We want to make sure that really dries in those cracks. Acrylic paint does dry pretty quickly, but I like to make sure it's fully dry before I move on to adding a second layer. And again, I started by mixing up a clear resin, making sure it was fully mixed before separating it into, in this instance, 3 different colors. I've got kind of a milky mica type color, a golden color, and a more pink color. Again, distributing those around in kind of a intentionally haphazard way before swirling them again, using the rubbing alcohol to spray and pop bubbles, and letting it cure overnight. Remember, since we're working in layers, we can actually adjust as we go. I thought that my base layer was a little bit too pink, so this one I did a little bit of an overcorrection and went more for a gold layer, and my final layer will probably be more pink and more translucent, but I absolutely love how this layer looks. As before, we waited until the next day, until this was at least partially cured, before we added in some of our marks and our cracks, and then we're going to again rub that acrylic paint into those cracks to give it a extra rocky look. At this point, you know the drill. We're working on our 3rd layer of this colorful resin. It's going to be our final rock type layer. We will do one final sealing layer after this, but this is the last one we're going to need to mix up the colors for. So go ahead and repeat those same steps we have been doing. Mix your resin, mix your colors, place it on in the pattern that you want. Once it's coating the layer that you want, pop any air bubbles, let it cure at least overnight, add in your cracks, highlight those cracks with acrylic paint, let it dry. And now it's time for our absolute final layer of resin. Since we introduced cracks and we put that acrylic paint in there, we want to actually seal those in because those will be hard to clean crevices, and possibly the acrylic paint could chip off eventually and get a lot of wear and tear. So it's best to just give this one nice final shiny coat of resin. Make sure this gets all the way to the edges so you don't leave any of those cracks exposed, and pop bubbles in that top layer. Then you really need to let this sit undisturbed in its location until its full cure time has elapsed. Make sure that your resin piece is completely cured, so the full cure time before you remove it, because if you remove it too quickly and then you set it on something, it can warp it. I am super happy with how this looks. That extra vinyl layer of the clear resin really just makes it perfect. Depending on how neat you were with your pouring or how much overflow or how level it was, you might have a little bit of cleanup to do on the edges. And you can sand this down and polish it. You can cut it off with scissors. You can kind of do whatever you need to do. Now, I will give a quick tip. This is a deburring tool that I'm going to be using for this, and it's usually used on the sides of metals to remove sharp edges, that burr that kind of forms when you cut metal, but it can be used for things like this too. So I can actually just run this right along. It's got a swivel head, and it will take off any of those super sharp points or extra pieces that are just kind of stuck on there. Once it's cleaned up and ready to go, it's time to attach the hardware if yours comes with any. Now, mine required drilling some holes to make sure that they actually fit through so I could put the handle on. And I love a good shortcut. You technically can measure this out right on your board if you want to, but sometimes it's really nice to make a little template that you can just tape on, and then you don't have to think, you just drill where it's supposed to be. So I cut a strip of paper to the width I wanted. I drew a line parallel to the edges where I wanted the handle to fall, and then I just inserted the screws into it and pushed down so they actually made a mark exactly where they need to be. Then you can tape your template directly onto your piece where you want the handles to fall, and then drill right through the template and through to the resin. Repeat for the other hole, and then you can reuse this template for the other side as well. Go ahead and screw your hardware in, and now your vanity tray is done. I'm so happy with the way this tray turned out. I think the rose quartz really came across, and those cracks and the different layers of it just added up to be the perfect rose quartz vanity tray. I can't wait to get my makeup on this. Thanks for watching My Modern Met Maker. If you're inspired to try this craft, you can find the links to purchase the materials you'll need in the description box below. Also, make sure to stick around for a special Tool Talk segment where we'll take a deeper dive into one of the supplies used in the project. Welcome to Tool Talk. Today I want to talk to you about this little tool. It's called a deburring tool. It has a sharp edge in the center, and it is beveled on both sides so you can use it from either direction, and it spins freely right at the top here. Initially, when I purchased this tool, I used it for silversmithing, and I would actually use it to create a nice smooth bevel on the inside of rings. But since then, I have found it useful in all sorts of other mediums. I've used it to remove the lip off of resin and smooth out areas on polymer clay as well. In order to use it, you will just simply take a sharp edge of something, place it on the edge of this, and in a smooth motion, you want to just carve off the sharp edge that is undesirable on your piece. For example, on this pair of polymer clay earrings that I did as a sample test, it has a bit of a lip here, and I can actually remove that really quickly just by placing the blade right here on the edge and then using my thumb to kind of help guide this, and it will slowly carve away to create a nice smooth bevel edge to this.